Derek Wilson, a young man who refuses to stay silent in the face of injustice. 2 years after his brother Marcus is wrongfully imprisoned due to the actions of two corrupt officers, Derek takes a stand, determined to expose the truth. Armed with hidden cameras, an unshakable resolve, and the support of unlikely allies, Derek embarks on a journey that will challenge a broken system and reveal the depths of abuse of power. But standing up to those who believe they are untouchable comes with consequences. As the tension rises and the stakes grow higher, Derek's fight becomes more than just about his brother. It's a fight for every voice that's been silenced, every life that's been ruined. Will justice prevail, or will those in power strike back with everything they have to bury the truth once again? The early evening sun bathed the quiet stretch of road in a dull golden light. Derek Wilson drove with the windows cracked just enough to let in the warm summer breeze. He could hear the faint hum of crickets in the distance, their constant rhythm underscoring the peaceful silence around him. The day had been long, his shift at the warehouse draining every ounce of energy from his body. But Derek felt that familiar weight in his chest, the weight that always crept in when he thought about his brother, Marcus. 2 years had passed since Marcus was taken from their lives. He had been wrongfully arrested and convicted after 2 police officers claimed they found drugs in his car. Derek knew better. Everyone who knew Marcus knew better. He was a good man, hardworking, kind, and honest. But no one listened. The officer's word held more weight than Marcus's pleas. Now, Marcus sat in a cell, forgotten by the system that had failed him, while Derek and their mother, Margaret, struggled to keep going. Derek's fingers tightened on the steering wheel as his mind replayed that day, like it always did. The sound of the judge's gavel, the hollow look on Marcus's face when the sentence was read, the way their mother had crumpled in the courtroom pew, as if the weight of it all had broken her completely. Derek had promised himself that day he would never forget. He would never let them get away with it. And now, after months of planning, Derek was ready to take the first step toward making things right. He reached toward the dashboard, his fingers brushing against the small button he had rigged under the radio. The hidden cameras, his own safeguard against history repeating itself, were ready to roll. He had installed them months ago after learning that the same officers who had framed Marcus, James Wright, and Ethan Moore were still patrolling the streets. He knew their routine. He knew their arrogance. And Derek was prepared for what might come. The faint squeal of tires broke the quiet, and Derek's gaze flicked to the rearview mirror. A pair of red and blue lights erupted into a blinding display behind him. His jaw tightened as the sound of sirens sliced through the air, pulling him abruptly from his thoughts. Derek took a slow, measured breath, his hands steady on the wheel. "Stay calm," he murmured to himself. He signaled and pulled the car off to the side of the road, parking on the gravel shoulder. The world seemed to slow as the cruiser rolled to a stop behind him. Derek adjusted the rearview mirror, his heartbeat steady, though his mind churned with memories. The last time Marcus had been pulled over, he never made it home. 2 doors opened, and Derek caught sight of the officers stepping out. Even from this distance, he recognized them. Officer James Wright, the taller one with a permanent scowl etched into his face, and Officer Ethan Moore, who always seemed like a shadow, trailing behind Wright without question. Derek watched their reflections as they approached, his thumb slipping under the radio to press the button. The hidden cameras blinked to life. Wright reached the driver's side window first, his posture rigid and imposing. The man leaned down, sunglasses perched on his face like a barrier between him and the world. "Evening," Wright said, his voice flat. "You know why we stopped you?" Derek kept his hands on the wheel, making sure they were visible. "No, sir," he replied calmly. "Care to explain?" "Broken taillight," Wright said, smirking slightly. "And you were driving a little erratically back there. Where you headed in such a hurry?" Derek's gaze flicked toward Moore, who had lingered near the back of the car, pacing lazily. Derek let the question hang in the air before answering. Just heading home. I did not realize I had a broken taillight. Wright's smile widened, but there was no kindness in it. Yeah, we will see about that. He tapped the window with his knuckles. License and registration. Derek moved slowly, retrieving his wallet and reaching for the glove compartment. He knew better than to make sudden movements, not with men like Wright. After handing over the documents, Derek watched as Wright glanced at the license, the smug grin never leaving his face. "Well, look at that," Wright said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Derek Wilson, got yourself a nice car here. Bit flashy, don't you think?" Derek said nothing. He knew the game Wright was playing. He had seen it all before. Silence was his shield. Wright straightened, glancing toward Moore with a nod. "Step out of the car," he ordered. Derek froze for half a second, but he recovered quickly. "Is there a reason for that, officer?" Wright leaned in closer, his voice dropping low. "You do not get to ask questions, son. Step out of the car, or this will get a lot worse for you." Derek's pulse quickened, but he remained outwardly calm. Slowly, he unbuckled his seatbelt and opened the door. The gravel crunched beneath his shoes as he stepped into the afternoon heat, the sun casting long shadows across the road. Wright motioned for him to place his hands on the hood of the car. "Let's keep this simple," Wright said, as Derek complied. Derek's reflection stared back at him in the windshield. He kept his focus steady, his mind sharp. Every insult, every unnecessary shove, everything was being recorded. This was not just for him. This was for Marcus. From behind, Moore opened the passenger door without asking. Derek turned his head slightly. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice even. "Did I say you could speak?" Wright barked, stepping close. He shoved Derek's shoulder roughly, forcing him back into position against the car. "Keep your mouth shut." Moore began rifling through the glove compartment, papers fluttering to the ground. After a moment, Derek heard the sound of Moore's voice, tinged with fake triumph. "Bingo," Moore called, holding up a small bag that had not been there before. Derek's heart sank, though his face remained calm. He had expected this, but seeing it happen in real time sent a flicker of anger through him. "What is this?" Wright said, holding the bag up to Derek's face, his smile spreading like oil on water. Derek did not answer. He knew it did not matter what he said. Wright and Moore had already decided the outcome. The only difference was that, this time, Derek had the truth on his side. Wright would not win. Not again. "You are going downtown," Wright sneered. "Think you are smarter than us? You are going to see what happens when you mess with the wrong people." Derek's knuckles whitened against the hood for just a moment before he steadied himself. His voice was calm, almost soft, when he finally spoke. "I would be careful if I were you," he said, his words deliberate. Wright laughed bitterly, shoving Derek's shoulder again. "Is that a threat?" "Not a threat," Derek replied. "Just advice." Wright's smirk faltered for the briefest moment before returning. "Cuff him," he barked at Moore. The cold metal of the handcuffs bit into Derek's wrists as Moore clicked them into place. The officers thought they were in control, but Derek knew the truth. Every second, every word, every shove had been captured, and this time, the truth would come to light. As Wright pushed him toward the cruiser, Derek glanced back at his car, at the cameras hidden just out of sight. A sense of calm washed over him. Wright and Moore might have won today, but this was far from over. Derek would make sure of it. This was for Marcus. This was for justice. And Derek would not stop until he got it. The metal door of the holding cell clanged shut, its harsh echo reverberating through the small, windowless room. Derek sat on the narrow bench, his back straight, his wrists sore from where the cuffs had bitten into his skin. The air smelled of sweat and stale concrete, a smell that clung to the walls of places like this, a smell he imagined Marcus knew far too well. Hours passed, but Derek remained still, his mind racing as he replayed the arrest. Every word, every shove, Every smug look from Wright and Moore was etched into his memory. This time, though, they had no idea what they had walked into. The footage was safe, already streaming in real time to a secure drive. His friend Jordan, a tech whiz he had known since high school, was monitoring it. If anything happened to Derek, the world would see the truth. The sound of footsteps broke his focus. The door creaked open, and a voice called out, "Wilson, you're being released." Derek stood, smoothing his rumpled shirt as he stepped toward the door. The officer avoided his eyes as he unlocked the cell. Derek knew why Wright and Moore had made a mess, and now everyone was scrambling to figure out what to do next. It was only the beginning. Outside the precinct, the night air felt cool against Derek's face. A black sedan sat waiting at the curb. The passenger window rolled down, and Derek let out a slow breath when he saw who it was. "Get in," Mr. Langston said, his voice calm but firm. Derek climbed into the car, sinking into the leather seat, with a mixture of exhaustion and relief. Mr. Langston, his lawyer and longtime family friend, glanced at him from the driver's seat. The man had always carried an air of quiet authority, sharp eyes, silver-streaked hair, and a suit that was never out of place. "They let you out quickly," Langston said, pulling away from the curb. "They know something is wrong." Derek nodded, staring out the window as streetlights flashed past. "They planted evidence," he said flatly, "just like they did to Marcus." Langston sighed deeply. "We knew they might pull something like this, but planting a bag of drugs on you, they're getting reckless." Derek turned to face him. "It's all on video. I had the cameras running the entire time." Langston's eyebrows lifted slightly, a flicker of approval crossing his face. "Good. That will help. But listen, Derek, this is not going to be easy. Wright and Moore have been doing this for years, and people like them, they're protected. You cannot take them down alone." "I am not alone," Derek replied quietly, his jaw tightening. "Not anymore." Langston parked outside Derek's apartment complex, an aging brick building on the edge of town. They sat in silence for a moment, the hum of the engine filling the space between them. "What's next?" Derek asked finally. Langston turned to face him, his expression serious. "First, I need to review the footage. We'll start building the case from there. But Derek," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "you need to be careful. They'll come after you again, and it won't just be on the road next time. They know what's at stake." Derek nodded, his gaze fixed on the apartment steps ahead of him. "I'm ready for whatever comes." Langston studied him for a moment before speaking again. "And Derek, this is bigger than Marcus now. If we do this right, we can expose everything. Not just for you or your brother, but for everyone they've hurt." Derek's throat tightened, but he nodded once more. "I won't stop until they're held accountable." Inside his apartment, Derek sat at his small kitchen table, surrounded by the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of cars outside. The place was modest, bare walls, a second-hand couch, a stack of bills sitting unopened by the window. He worked hard to keep this roof over his head and to support his mother, but it was a constant struggle. His phone buzzed on the table, and he snatched it up. Jordan's name flashed on the screen. Derek answered quickly. "You're good, man," Jordan said, his voice steady but tinged with worry. "The footage is crystal clear, and I've backed it up to 3 different servers. No way they're deleting this." Derek exhaled in relief. "Thanks, Jordan. I owe you for this." "Just keep your head down," Jordan warned. "Wright and Moore aren't going to let this slide. They'll come at you sideways." "I know," Derek replied, "but we've got them this time." Jordan paused for a moment before speaking again, his tone quieter now. "How's your mom holding up?" She's strong," Derek said, though his voice faltered slightly. "But she's been through enough. I can't let them get away with this, Jordan. Not after what they did to Marcus." "I get it, man," Jordan said softly. "Just be careful. Call me if you need anything." When the call ended, Derek leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. His body felt heavy with exhaustion, but his mind refused to rest. He thought about Marcus, about the years his brother had lost because two men with badges decided his life did not matter. The thought sent a flicker of rage through Derek's chest, but he took a deep breath, forcing himself to focus. Anger would not help him now. Only the truth would. Suddenly, there was a soft knock at the door. Derek froze for a moment, his heart pounding. He stood carefully, his footsteps silent on the creaking floor as he approached the peephole. His shoulders relaxed slightly when he saw who it was. He opened the door to find Lisa Collins, the local journalist who had been covering stories of police misconduct in the community. She was a small woman in her early 30s, with sharp eyes and a notebook always in hand. "Lisa," Derek said, surprised. "What are you doing here?" Lisa offered a small, reassuring smile. "I heard what happened. You okay?" "I'm fine," Derek replied, stepping aside to let her in. Lisa walked into the apartment, looking around briefly before setting her bag down on the table. "I saw the video. Jordan sent me a copy." She glanced at Derek, her expression serious. "You have them dead to rights, Derek. This footage, it's going to change everything." Derek rubbed the back of his neck, unsure what to say. "I hope so." Lisa pulled out her notepad and looked at him intently. "I want to help you get this story out. People need to see what happened to you, what happened to Marcus. If you let me tell the truth, we can make sure everyone hears it." Derek hesitated. He had spent so long feeling like no one believed him, like the system was too powerful to fight. But now, Lisa's sincerity was undeniable. She was here because she cared. She was offering help. And for once, Derek felt like he did not have to carry this burden alone. "Okay," he said finally, his voice steady. "Let's tell the truth." Lisa smiled faintly, pulling out her recorder. "Good. The truth is going to set a lot of people free." As they sat down to talk, Derek felt something shift inside him. For the first time in a long time, he did not feel completely alone. He had allies now: Jordan, Langston, Lisa, and he could feel the first cracks forming in the wall Wright and Moore had built around themselves. The fight was far from over, but Derek had taken the first step. He was ready for whatever came next. The morning sun crept through the blinds of Derek's apartment, casting thin streaks of light across his kitchen table. His phone buzzed relentlessly, its vibrations rattling the wood. Derek sat with a steaming cup of coffee cradled between his hands, staring at the screen. Notifications flooded in: calls, texts, news alerts. Overnight, everything had changed. Lisa Collins had kept her word. The footage of Derek's arrest had been published on her platform and shared across social media. The video, crystal clear and irrefutable, had struck a nerve. The comment section was alive with outrage, questions, and cries for accountability. Derek scrolled through the headlines, each one louder than the last. Caught on camera, local officers accused of planting evidence. The Wilson family, a fight for justice, 2 years in the making. Systemic injustice, community demands answers in latest police misconduct case. He could hardly believe it. His brother Marcus's name was finally being spoken again, not in whispers of guilt, but in calls for justice. The phone buzzed again, pulling Derek from his thoughts. This time, it was a call. Jordan's name flashed on the screen. Derek answered quickly. "Man, are you seeing this?" Jordan's voice crackled with excitement. "Your story's everywhere." Derek let out a slow breath. "Yeah, I'm seeing it. They're calling for an investigation into Wright and Moore. Reggie Thompson's rallying folks in the community, too. He's putting together a protest outside the precinct tomorrow." "Reggie?" Derek asked, sitting up straighter. "I thought he stepped back from organizing after what happened last year." "Not anymore," Jordan said. "He reached out to Lisa after the story dropped. Says this is bigger than just your case. This is about everybody they've hurt. You lit the fire, man." Derek felt a flicker of something he had not felt in a long time: hope. I just want them to see the truth, he said quietly. They're seeing it, trust me, but listen, stay sharp. Wright and Moore aren't the type to back down. They're probably watching this unfold just like we are, and you know they're not happy. I'm ready, Derek said. That afternoon, Derek sat in Mr. Langston's office. The walls were lined with law books and old case files, a silent reminder of battles won and lost. Langston sat behind his desk, a laptop open in front of him. The video played on mute. Wright's face frozen mid-shout as he shoved Derek against the hood of his car. This footage is explosive, Langston said, closing the laptop. It's already caught the attention of people higher up. I received a call this morning. Internal Affairs has opened a preliminary inquiry into Wright and Moore. Derek nodded slowly. That's a start. Langston's sharp gaze settled on him. It's a good start, but this is far from over. Wright and Moore aren't going to sit quietly while this unfolds. We need to be prepared for pushback. I don't care what they try to do, Derek said, his voice firm. They planted that evidence, and they need to answer for it. Langston leaned back in his chair, studying Derek carefully. You're stronger than most people would be in your position. That's why we're here. But Derek, be smart about this. Let us handle the legal fight. You've already done the hard part by exposing them. Derek rubbed his hands together, the faint ache in his wrists, a reminder of the cuffs from the day before. I just want to make sure they don't get away with this again. I can't let what happened to Marcus happen to someone else. Langston nodded slowly. We won't let that happen. A knock at the door interrupted them, and Langston called for the visitor to come in. The door opened, and Lisa stepped inside, her notepad in one hand and a takeout coffee in the other. Sorry to interrupt, she said, offering Derek a small smile. I wanted to update you both. Langston gestured to the chair beside Derek. Please, sit. Lisa settled into the seat, flipping open her notepad. The video's taken on a life of its own. People are sharing it nationwide. I've been contacted by a few larger news outlets who want to run the story. More importantly, she hesitated, glancing between Derek and Langston. Other people are coming forward. What do you mean? Derek asked. Lisa set her notepad on the desk and leaned forward, her tone serious. I've had 2 families reach out to me in the last 24 hours. Both of them claim Wright and Moore planted evidence on their loved ones, just like they did to Marcus. One of them even has old records showing inconsistencies in Wright's reports. Derek's heart skipped a beat. Why didn't they come forward before? Lisa sighed. Fear. They felt like no one would believe them. But your footage, your story, it's giving them courage. People are finally starting to speak up. Langston tapped a pen thoughtfully against his desk. This could change everything. If we can build a pattern of misconduct, Wright and Moore won't just be facing an inquiry, they'll be facing criminal charges. Derek stared at Lisa, the weight of her words sinking in. Other people. It was not just Marcus. He had always known that deep down, but hearing it now, the truth felt heavier than he expected. How many others had been silenced? How many families had been broken? He swallowed hard. Do you think they'll go public with their stories? Lisa nodded. Some of them, yes. They're scared, but they're angry too. They've been carrying this for years, and they want justice, just like you do. Derek looked down at his hands, his mind racing. For so long, he had felt like he was carrying this weight alone, Marcus's voice unheard, their family's pain ignored. But now, there were others, and the truth was starting to break through the cracks. That evening, Derek returned home to find his mother waiting on the couch, her eyes fixed on the television. Margaret Wilson was a quiet woman, but her strength had always been the foundation of their family. Her face was lined with worry, but as Derek stepped into the room, she managed a small smile. "You're home," she said softly. "Yeah, Mom," Derek replied, sitting beside her. The news was on, replaying clips of his arrest alongside headlines demanding action. His mother's hands were clasped tightly in her lap. "It's everywhere," she murmured. People are talking about Marcus again. Derek looked at her, his chest tightening. They're not just talking, Mom. They're listening this time. She turned to him, tears welling in her eyes. You're doing what I always prayed someone would do, Derek. You're fighting for him. Derek nodded, his voice steady but thick with emotion. It's not just for Marcus anymore. There are other families, Mom. Other people they've hurt. Margaret reached over and squeezed his hand, her touch warm and comforting. Then keep fighting for all of them. Derek sat with his mother long into the evening, the television a quiet hum in the background. For the first time in years, he felt like Marcus's voice was finally being heard. The weight he had carried for so long felt just a little lighter. The next day, Derek stood at the edge of a growing crowd outside the police precinct. Signs waved in the air, their messages loud and clear. Justice for Marcus Wilson. Hold Wright and Moore accountable. End police corruption. Reggie Thompson stood on a makeshift stage, his deep voice booming through a microphone as he addressed the crowd. We are here because enough is enough. The crowd roared in agreement, their energy electric. Derek watched as families, young and old, gathered together. Lisa was there, taking notes, while Jordan waved him over from the side. You started this, man, Jordan said, clapping a hand on Derek's shoulder. Derek shook his head. No, we started this. All of us. As he looked out at the crowd, Derek felt a flicker of hope ignite in his chest. The fight was far from over, but this was a spark that could become something bigger. For Marcus, for his mother, for every family whose voices had been silenced. The truth was out, and this time, it would not be ignored. The morning sun was bright, but the atmosphere around the precinct felt dark and heavy. The crowd from the day before had scattered, leaving behind a trail of crumpled flyers and discarded signs on the sidewalk. Derek stood across the street with his hands tucked into his jacket pockets, watching the front doors of the police station. Officers came and went, some ignoring the protest signs still taped to the walls, while others glanced around nervously as if they were waiting for something or someone to crack. Derek's mind buzzed with everything that had happened over the last 48 hours. Lisa's article had spread like wildfire, the footage from his arrest viewed by thousands of people across the country. Social media was ablaze with questions, accusations, and demands for accountability. People he had never met were now rallying around his brother's name and sharing their own stories of injustice. But Derek also knew what this kind of attention meant. Pressure. Pressure that could push people like Wright and Moore to the edge. His phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. He pulled it from his pocket and answered. Jordan? You've got to see this, man, Jordan said breathlessly on the other end. Turn on Channel 5. Now. Derek hurried back to his apartment, his pulse quickening. He grabbed the remote and turned on the television. The screen flashed to a live broadcast outside the police precinct, where Lisa Collins stood, microphone in hand. Behind her, the police chief, a stern-looking man in his late 50s, was holding a press conference. The camera panned to reporters shouting questions, their voices overlapping. Lisa's voice cut through the noise. Chief Williams, can you confirm the status of officers James Wright and Ethan Moore? The chief's expression was tight, as if he had already said more than he wanted to. He raised a hand to silence the crowd before speaking. I can confirm that officers Wright and Moore have been placed on administrative leave, pending a full investigation by Internal Affairs. Derek leaned forward, his heart pounding. The words hung in the air like a spark waiting to ignite. Lisa pushed further, stepping toward the podium. Chief Williams, is the department aware of the growing number of accusations against these officers? Are you taking those claims seriously? The chief's jaw tightened, but he nodded stiffly. We are aware of the allegations, and we encourage anyone with relevant information to come forward. This department will cooperate fully with the investigation. The reporters erupted with more questions, but Derek's attention remained locked on the chief's final words. We encourage anyone to come forward." By that afternoon, Derek's apartment felt less like a home and more like a command center. The table was covered in papers, printouts of news articles, screenshots of comments online, and names of people who had reached out to Lisa with their own stories. Jordan sat across from Derek, typing furiously on his laptop, while Lisa paced the small living room, her phone pressed to her ear. "Another one," Lisa said, ending her call. "That's 3 people today. All of them say the same thing: planted evidence, intimidation, falsified reports." Derek rubbed his forehead, trying to absorb it all. "How many more are out there?" Lisa shook her head. "More than we know. People are scared, Derek. Wright and Moore have been untouchable for so long that most of these families don't believe anything will change." Derek's jaw tightened. "It will change. We'll make sure of it." Jordan spun his laptop around, pointing to a post that had gone viral. "Look at this. Someone found an old case file where Wright's testimony directly contradicted another officer's report. It's messy, man. People are digging now." Derek leaned in to read the post. The comments beneath it were filled with outrage. "How did no one see this before? This goes deeper than 2 bad cops. Justice for Marcus Wilson." Lisa sat down beside him, her tone softening. "You started something big, Derek. People are paying attention." Derek nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. He knew that Wright and Moore wouldn't go down without a fight. For men like them, power wasn't just a job, it was their identity. And when people like that felt their grip slipping, they got dangerous. He was proven right the next morning. Derek was leaving his apartment, a duffel bag slung over his shoulder, when he noticed something off. His car, parked in the usual spot, looked different. He stepped closer, his brow furrowing. The passenger window had been smashed, shards of glass scattered across the seat and pavement. The tires had been slashed, the rubber sitting flat and lifeless against the asphalt. For a moment, Derek just stood there, his fists clenching at his sides as anger surged through him. He knew exactly what this was: a message, a warning. "Derek?" He turned to see Mrs. Lewis, his neighbor from across the hall, peeking out from her doorway. She was an older woman, with gray curls and a habit of baking too much food for one person. Her eyes were wide with concern. "Are you all right, honey?" she asked. Derek forced himself to unclench his hands and nod. "Yeah, I'm fine." Mrs. Lewis stepped out of her apartment, her house slippers shuffling against the floor. "That doesn't look fine to me," she said, glancing at the car. "Who would do something like that?" Derek hesitated, not wanting to drag her into something she didn't need to be part of. "Just people who don't want me talking." Her expression softened. "It's about your brother, isn't it? I saw the news. I knew Marcus, you know. Sweet boy." Derek looked at her, surprised. "You knew Marcus?" She smiled faintly, though it was tinged with sadness. "Of course. He used to carry my groceries up the stairs when my knees gave me trouble. Never asked for anything in return." Derek swallowed the lump in his throat. He could almost see it, Marcus grinning as he carried heavy bags up the narrow staircase. That was just who Marcus was. Mrs. Lewis reached out and touched Derek's arm gently. "What you're doing takes courage, Derek. Don't let them scare you." Her words were simple, but they hit him like a wave. For so long, he had felt like no one saw him, like no one cared. But here she was, a neighbor he had barely spoken to, offering him a kind word when he needed it most. "Thanks," Derek said quietly. She nodded, then tilted her head toward the car. "Let me call someone about that window for you. My nephew owns a repair shop. He'll take care of it." Derek blinked in surprise. "You don't have to do that." "Nonsense," she replied firmly. "Sometimes the only way to fight darkness is with a little light. Now go on, I'll handle it." Derek stared at her for a moment before nodding. "Thank you, Mrs. Lewis." As he walked back upstairs to call Langston, Derek felt the anger in his chest soften just a little. People like Wright and Moore thrived on fear. They wanted him to feel alone, small, powerless. But Mrs. Lewis's kindness reminded him that he wasn't. He had people who believed in him, people who wanted him to keep fighting. Later that evening, Derek sat across from Langston in the lawyer's office, recounting what had happened with the car. Langston listened, his expression tight with concern. "They're getting desperate," Langston said finally. "That's a good thing. It means they're scared." Derek nodded, his voice calm but firm. "They should be." Langston leaned forward, his eyes sharp. "We keep pushing. More families are stepping forward, and internal affairs is moving faster than I expected. Wright and Moore are running out of room to hide." Derek sat back, thinking of Marcus, of the shattered glass, of Mrs. Lewis's quiet strength. The walls were closing in on Wright and Moore, but Derek was just getting started. The late afternoon sun cast long, fading shadows across Derek's living room. He stood at the window, watching a tow truck load his damaged car onto its flatbed. The slashed tires and shattered glass had been cleaned up, but the image of it lingered in his mind. A quiet warning meant to rattle him. Behind him, Jordan sat on the couch, laptop balanced on his knees, typing furiously. Lisa leaned against the wall, her phone in hand, scrolling through updates. Despite their calm appearances, the tension in the air was thick. Derek turned away from the window and sank into the armchair opposite them. "Did you hear back from Internal Affairs?" he asked Lisa, breaking the silence. She looked up, tucking her phone into her pocket. "I got a response this morning. They've officially confirmed the investigation into Wright and Moore." "That's progress," Jordan said, glancing up from his laptop. "But it's not enough yet. These guys have been playing the system for years. We need to keep the pressure up." Derek nodded, his jaw tightening. "It's not just about them. It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. Ever." Lisa's expression softened. "I spoke with 2 more families last night. Both of them described the same tactics: false stops, intimidation, planted evidence. Wright and Moore targeted people they thought wouldn't fight back." Derek looked at her sharply. "Are they willing to go on record?" "Not yet," Lisa admitted. "They're scared, Derek. They've seen what happens when you stand up to men like Wright." "Then I'll show them," Derek said, his voice steady. "We can't stop now. We've come too far." That evening, Derek sat at the kitchen table, his phone pressed to his ear as he spoke quietly with his mother. The house was silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the faint rustle of papers on the table. "I'm fine, Mom," Derek said, though his voice betrayed the weariness creeping into his bones. "I saw what happened to your car on the news," Margaret replied. "They're trying to scare you, Derek, just like they did to Marcus." Derek's grip tightened around the phone. "They won't win this time." "I worry about you," she said softly. "You've taken so much on your shoulders, but you don't have to carry this alone. Let people help you." He sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I know, Mom. People are helping." He thought of Lisa, Jordan, Langston, and even Mrs. Lewis, ordinary people who had shown him kindness and support when he needed it most. "Your brother would be so proud of you," Margaret continued, her voice thick with emotion. "I know I am." Derek closed his eyes for a moment, letting her words settle over him like a blanket. "Thanks, Mom. I'll be careful. I promise." The next morning, Derek arrived at Langston's office to find the lawyer already deep in conversation with Reggie Thompson. Reggie, a towering man with graying hair and a booming voice, had once been the face of community activism in their neighborhood. He had stepped back after threats against his family the year before, but now the fire had returned to his eyes. "Good to see you again, Reggie," Derek said, shaking his hand firmly. "You too, young man," Reggie replied, his deep voice carrying a warmth that eased some of Derek's tension. "You've got guts. Not a lot of folks would stand up the way you have." Derek offered a small, tired smile. I just want to finish what they started with Marcus. Reggie nodded, his expression serious. We're not letting this slide. Tomorrow's protest outside City Hall is going to be bigger than the last. Families who've been hurt by Wright and Moore are starting to show up. We'll make sure the city hears us loud and clear. Langston leaned forward, his hands steepled on the desk. This is important, Derek. Public pressure keeps their feet to the fire. The more people who come forward, the harder it will be for Wright and Moore to wriggle out of this. Reggie turned to Derek, his gaze steady. I want you to speak, Derek. You've been the face of this fight from the beginning. People need to hear your story. Derek hesitated, the weight of Reggie's words settling on him. He had spent so long trying to avoid the spotlight, but now there was no turning back. I'll do it, he said firmly. If it means justice for Marcus and everyone else they hurt, I'll do whatever it takes. That afternoon, Derek sat on the balcony of his apartment, staring out at the city skyline. His phone sat beside him, vibrating occasionally with calls or texts, but he ignored it for now. The weight of everything felt heavier today, like the more progress they made, the more it cost him. He thought of Marcus, of the years his brother had lost, because two men in uniform decided his life did not matter. The memory of Marcus's voice, strong and certain, even in the face of injustice, echoed in his mind. You're going to fix this, little brother. You'll make it right. Derek exhaled slowly, steadying himself. He had no choice but to keep going. If Marcus had endured what they put him through, Derek could handle this. The buzz of the doorbell broke his thoughts. He stood, moving carefully to the door. When he opened it, he was surprised to find a familiar face. Tommy Blake, the retired officer who had approached him at the rally days earlier. Tommy, Derek said, startled. What are you doing here? Tommy shifted awkwardly on his feet, his worn baseball cap in his hands. Can I come in for a minute? There's something I need to tell you. Derek stepped aside, letting him in. Tommy sat at the table, looking older than Derek remembered, like a man weighed down by years of regret. I saw what happened to your car, Tommy said after a moment. I figured Wright would start pulling stunts like that. He's a snake, always has been. You used to work with him, didn't you? Derek asked carefully. Tommy nodded, his expression darkening. Yeah, I did, and I ignored a lot of things I shouldn't have. That's on me. He sighed deeply, rubbing a hand over his face. But I can't let this go on anymore. Wright and Moore have been hurting people for years, and I've got something that might help you. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick manila envelope, sliding it across the table. Derek stared at it for a moment before picking it up. What is it? Copies of old complaints against Wright, Tommy said quietly. Things that got swept under the rug. I had friends in the department who were scared to say anything. But now, he looked at Derek, his gaze steady. Now, you've got people listening. This can't be buried anymore. Derek opened the envelope, his heart pounding as he flipped through the papers. Formal complaints, written statements, evidence that Wright had been untouchable for far too long. Why are you doing this? Derek asked, his voice low. Tommy looked down at his hands, his shoulders slumping. Because I was part of the problem for too long. And because I owe it to Marcus. I should have done something when I had the chance. Derek swallowed hard, the weight of Tommy's words settling over him. This was more than just evidence. It was a chance to expose everything. Thank you, Derek said softly. Tommy nodded, standing to leave. Keep fighting, Derek. You're doing what a lot of us didn't have the guts to do. As the door clicked shut behind him, Derek sat back in his chair, the envelope heavy in his hands. For years, the truth had been buried under silence and fear. But now, piece by piece, it was coming to light. The cost of truth was high, but Derek knew it was worth it. Because this fight wasn't just for Marcus anymore, it was for everyone who had been silenced. The next morning, Derek sat at Mr. Langston's office, the manila envelope Tommy Blake had delivered the night before spread out on the large oak desk. Langston flipped through the papers, his face impassive, but his sharp eyes scanning every word. A silence hung between them, broken only by the soft shuffle of documents and the distant hum of a fax machine in the hallway. "This is damning," Langston said finally, setting one page down with a firm slap. "Formal complaints, witness statements. Tommy wasn't exaggerating. Wright and Moore should have been removed from the force years ago." Derek leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. "Why weren't they?" Langston gave him a look, his expression heavy with unspoken truth. "The same reason Marcus went to prison. A system that protects itself before it protects people. These reports were buried because nobody was willing to challenge them. Until now." Derek looked at the documents, anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. Marcus's face flashed in his mind, his brother's weary smile the last time he saw him behind those prison bars. He pushed the memory aside and nodded toward Langston. "We're challenging them now." Langston straightened in his chair. "With these reports, Internal Affairs won't be able to sweep this under the rug. I'll forward these documents directly to the investigators. You've given them more than enough ammunition to move forward." He paused, his tone turning cautious. "But Derek, this is going to get uglier. Wright and Moore are desperate, and they know they're running out of time." "I don't care," Derek said firmly, his voice steady. "Let them do their worst. They don't scare me anymore." Langston studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Good, we're close, Derek. Closer than we've ever been." That afternoon, Lisa met Derek at a quiet diner on the edge of town. The place was old, with cracked vinyl booths and a coffee machine that gurgled loudly every few minutes. It was the kind of place where no one asked questions, and that was exactly what they needed right now. Lisa slid into the booth across from Derek, a notebook in one hand and a stack of papers in the other. "I just got back from talking to another family," she said, her voice low but urgent. "It's happening, Derek. More people are coming forward. Families, former officers' people, who've been silent for years." Derek looked up from his coffee, a mix of surprise and hope flickering in his eyes. "How many?" Lisa flipped through her notebook. 8 families so far, but the number is growing. It's like once one person spoke up, it gave everyone else the courage to do the same. She paused, tapping her pen against the edge of the table. "This is bigger than Wright and Moore. It's about the culture that allowed them to get away with this for so long." Derek nodded slowly, his mind racing. "It's not just about me anymore, or Marcus." Lisa gave him a small, encouraging smile. "No, but you're the reason this is happening. You lit the match, Derek." He sat back against the booth, her words sinking in. He had never wanted to be in the spotlight, but he knew now that this fight was about more than justice for his brother. It was about giving a voice to everyone who had been silenced, people who had been afraid to come forward, who believed the system would always win. The thought filled him with a mix of resolve and exhaustion. "What's next?" he asked quietly. Lisa's expression turned serious. "I've reached out to the families willing to go on record. Some of them are ready to tell their stories. Others are still scared, but they're watching you, Derek. They want to see if this is real." "It's real," Derek said firmly, "and I'll prove it." Lisa leaned forward, her voice softening. "Are you ready for tomorrow's protest? Reggie says it's going to be the biggest one yet." Derek exhaled slowly, staring down at his half-empty cup of coffee. "I'll be there." "You know Wright and Moore will try something," Lisa warned. "They're cornered. Desperation makes people dangerous." "I know," Derek said, "but I can't back down now." The next day, Derek stood in the center of the growing crowd outside City Hall. People streamed into the square from every direction, families holding handmade signs, young people waving banners, older neighbors who had lived in the community long enough to remember a time when speaking out felt like a lost cause. Reggie stood on a small stage set up at the front of the square, his booming voice carrying over the crowd. "This isn't just about one man's story," Reggie said, gesturing toward the crowd. "This is about a system that turned its back on all of us. How many Marcus Wilsons do we have to lose before something changes? How many families have to suffer in silence before justice is served? The crowd roared in agreement, the energy palpable. Derek stood near the stage, his fists clenched at his sides, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Jordan appeared at his side, clapping a hand on his shoulder. "They're here for you, man," Jordan said, his voice filled with pride. "This is the moment. Go up there and show them why we're fighting." Derek hesitated, feeling the eyes of the crowd on him. He took a deep breath and climbed the steps to the stage. Reggie handed him the microphone and stepped back, giving Derek the space he needed. For a moment, the noise of the crowd faded, and all Derek could hear was his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. He gripped the microphone tightly, scanning the faces in front of him. Some were familiar, others were not, but they were all here for the same reason. "My name is Derek Wilson," he began, his voice steady, despite the knot in his chest. "2 years ago, my brother Marcus was taken from us because 2 officers decided his life didn't matter. They planted evidence, lied to a judge, and sent him to prison for a crime he didn't commit." The crowd fell silent, the weight of his words hanging heavy in the air. "They thought no one would care," Derek continued. "They thought no one would believe us, but we believed. And now, because of all of you, the truth is finally coming to light." A cheer erupted from the crowd, but Derek held up a hand, quieting them. "This isn't just about Marcus anymore. It's about every single person who has been silenced, every family that has been broken, every life that has been destroyed because men like Wright and Moore thought they were untouchable. But they're not." The crowd roared again, louder this time. Derek's voice grew stronger, fueled by their energy. "We're here today because the truth matters, because justice matters, and we won't stop until we get it." He paused, letting the words settle over the crowd. "Marcus couldn't fight for himself, but I will fight for him, and for every person who has been told their life doesn't matter. We're not backing down." The square erupted into cheers, chants of "Justice for Marcus" ringing out across the air. Derek stepped back from the microphone, his chest rising and falling with steady breaths. Reggie clapped him on the back as he stepped down from the stage. "You did good, son," Reggie said, his voice gruff but filled with pride. Derek looked out at the crowd, at the people holding signs and chanting his brother's name. For the first time, he felt like Marcus was there with him, like his brother's voice was finally being heard. As the sun began to set over the square, Derek's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw a message from Lisa. It was short, but it sent a shiver down his spine. "Wright and Moore are on the move. Be careful tonight." Derek read the message twice, his jaw tightening. The fight was far from over. Wright and Moore were desperate, and desperate men were dangerous. But Derek knew one thing for sure. He wasn't afraid of them anymore. The crowd had begun to thin, as the evening light dimmed. The chants of "Justice for Marcus" still echoed faintly in Derek's ears as he made his way back to his apartment. The rally had been bigger than he ever imagined. People had shown up from all over the city, some holding signs bearing Marcus's name, others carrying messages like "End police corruption" and "Hold Wright and Moore accountable." It felt like momentum, a force too strong to stop. But that momentum came with a price. Derek glanced over his shoulder as he turned the corner onto his street. He had always been aware of his surroundings, a habit born from necessity in neighborhoods where you learn to watch your back. But tonight, his instincts were sharper. A car sat parked halfway down the block, its headlights off. It looked familiar, but he couldn't place it. Derek slowed his pace, keeping his eyes on it for a few extra seconds before heading up the steps to his apartment. When he stepped inside, the silence felt heavy, pressing against him like a weight. Derek locked the door behind him and dropped his keys onto the counter, his eyes lingering on the curtains as he checked that the windows were closed. It wasn't paranoia. He knew what men like Wright and Moore were capable of when they felt cornered. His phone buzzed on the table, pulling him from his thoughts. He grabbed it quickly, half expecting another warning from Lisa. But this time, it was Jordan. "Hey," Derek answered, trying to sound calm. "Derek," Jordan said, his voice low and urgent. "You're not home, are you?" "I just got in." "Why?" Jordan swore under his breath. "I think something's going down. I just saw a car parked outside your building. Same one that was outside the rally earlier. I don't like it, man." Derek's blood ran cold as he turned toward the window, lifting the edge of the curtain just enough to see the street below. The car was still there, its dark outline barely visible under the glow of the street lamp. "Same car?" Derek asked, his voice steady, though his hands had begun to tighten into fists. "Yeah," Jordan replied. "Look, you need to get out of there. Wright and Moore are desperate. This could be them or somebody they sent." Derek felt his pulse quicken, but he forced himself to stay calm. "I'm not running, Jordan." "Derek, listen to me." "I said I'm not running," Derek repeated, his voice firmer this time. "I'm done being scared of them." Jordan let out a frustrated sigh. "Fine, but lock everything down, and if anything happens, you call me, you hear?" "I hear you," Derek said before ending the call. He stared at his phone for a moment, then slipped it into his pocket. He walked to the kitchen, grabbed a glass of water, and took a slow sip. His mind raced, piecing together the possibilities. The rally had been a success, but it had also put him in the crosshairs. Wright and Moore weren't the type to sit back and let their world crumble. A faint knock broke the silence. Derek froze, his grip tightening around the glass. It was soft, too soft. Whoever was on the other side of the door didn't want to be heard. His heart began to pound, but his movements were deliberate as he set the glass down and moved toward the door. He didn't make a sound, his footsteps light against the floorboards. Another knock, louder this time. "Derek?" a voice called, muffled through the door. "It's Lisa." Relief flooded through him, though he was careful not to let his guard down too quickly. He opened the door just a crack, peering through it. Lisa stood outside, her expression tight, her hands shoved into the pockets of her jacket. "What are you doing here?" Derek asked, pulling the door open fully. "It's late." Lisa slipped inside, glancing behind her before Derek shut the door. "I had to come," she said quickly. "Something's happening, Derek. I got a tip earlier that Wright and Moore are trying to discredit you. They've been feeding a fake story to another news outlet saying you're the one who doctored the footage." Derek's jaw tightened. "They're calling me a liar." Lisa nodded, her face serious. "They're losing control, and they know it. This is their last move, discredit you before the investigation can take them down." Derek leaned back against the door, his fists clenching at his sides. He had expected this. Wright and Moore were like cornered animals, now dangerous, unpredictable. But hearing it still stung. "What can we do?" Derek asked after a moment. Lisa set her bag down on the table and pulled out her laptop. "We fight back with the truth. We double down. I've got more families ready to tell their stories, and I'm publishing another piece tonight." "But Derek?" She looked at him carefully. "You need to stay safe. Wright and Moore are spiraling. If they can't destroy your reputation, they might come after you directly." "I know," Derek said quietly. Lisa's expression softened. "You've already done so much, Derek. This is bigger than just you now." "I know that too," Derek replied, his voice steady. "But I can't stop now, not after everything they've done." Lisa held his gaze for a moment before nodding. "Then let's make sure they can't run from this." That night, Derek sat on the edge of his bed, the glow of his phone illuminating his face. Lisa's latest article had gone live, and already the comments were pouring in. The headline was damning. "Years of abuse. Families speak out against officers Wright and Moore." Lisa had pulled no punches, weaving together the stories of those who had come forward. The picture was clear. Wright and Moore weren't rogue officers making mistakes, they were predators who had targeted people for years, knowing the system would protect them. As Derek scrolled through the article, his phone buzzed with a call. The screen flashed with Jordan's name. Derek answered quickly. "Derek," Jordan said, his voice tense. "Man, something's happening. I just saw—" A loud crash interrupted him. Derek shot to his feet, his heart slamming in his chest as the sound of breaking glass echoed from the living room. He turned toward the doorway, his muscles tensing. Someone was in his apartment. "Jordan," Derek said into the phone, his voice low but urgent. "Call the police. Someone's here." "Derek!" Jordan shouted, but Derek hung up, slipping the phone into his pocket as he moved cautiously toward the living room. The sound of footsteps crunched over broken glass, and a shadow moved against the wall. Derek stepped into the room, his voice calm but firm. "Who's there?" The shadow froze. Then, Wright stepped forward, his face barely visible under the dim light from the street lamp outside. His lips curled into a smug sneer. "Evening, Derek," Wright said softly, his voice dripping with venom. "You've been making a lot of noise lately." Derek's heart pounded, but he didn't flinch. "You shouldn't be here." Wright took a slow step closer. "You think you're smart? You think you've won?" "I know I've won," Derek said coldly. Wright's sneer faltered for half a second, replaced by something darker desperation. "You don't know what you're doing, boy. You don't know who you're messing with." Derek stood his ground, his voice calm and unshaken. "The world knows who you are now, Wright, and nothing you do will stop it." Wright's eyes burned with rage as he took another step forward. But before he could speak, the faint wail of approaching sirens broke the silence. Derek's phone buzzed in his pocket. Jordan's message. "They're on their way." Wright froze, his shoulders stiffening. The sound of sirens grew louder, filling the air like a warning bell. Derek's gaze remained locked on him, unblinking. "You're done," Derek said quietly. For a moment, Wright just stared at him, his face twisted with anger and something else, fear. Then, without a word, he turned and slipped out through the broken window, disappearing into the night. Derek exhaled slowly, his hands shaking slightly as the sirens arrived outside. Blue and red lights danced across his walls, and Derek knew the tide had turned. Wright was running now, but he couldn't hide forever. The truth was out, and justice was coming. The broken window in Derek's apartment had been boarded up, a crude patch on a night he would never forget. The faint glow of morning sunlight spilled across the living room floor as he sat at his small kitchen table. His hands were wrapped around a mug of coffee that had long since gone cold, but his mind was far away, replaying the moment James Wright had slipped through the shadows and into his home. Wright's voice still echoed in his ears. "You don't know who you're messing with." Derek shook the memory off, forcing his attention back to the moment. The sound of police sirens had chased Wright into the night, but it hadn't erased the chill that lingered in Derek's bones. Wright had been desperate, dangerous even. But that desperation told Derek everything he needed to know. Wright and Moore were losing their grip. The faint knock on the door startled him, but he stood quickly, checking the peephole this time before opening it. On the other side stood Langston, his tie straight, his face serious but calm as ever. "Good morning," Langston said, stepping inside. He glanced at the boarded window, his brow furrowing. "They're getting sloppy." Derek shut the door behind him. "Yeah, but it didn't work. I'm still here." Langston gave him a small nod of approval before dropping his briefcase onto the table. "Good, because we've got a lot to handle today. Internal Affairs wants to meet, and more importantly, they're bringing Wright and Moore in for questioning." Derek straightened, his eyes narrowing. "Finally." "It's happening, Derek," Langston said, opening the briefcase and pulling out a thick file. "They can't run from this anymore. The department is feeling the pressure. Lisa's articles, the rallies, the families coming forward. It's all adding up. Wright and Moore are cornered, and the system that protected them for so long is starting to crack." Derek sat down, leaning forward as Langston spread out a series of documents. "What happens now?" Langston tapped one of the papers. We keep the momentum. Internal Affairs is moving quickly, but we need to make sure they have everything they need. They'll want to interview you again today about your arrest, the footage, and any contact Wright and Moore have had with you since. His gaze flicked to the broken window. Including this. I'll tell them everything, Derek said firmly. I'm not holding back. Langston nodded. Good. This time, they'll have no choice but to listen. The meeting with Internal Affairs was held at a neutral office building downtown far away from the precinct where Wright and Moore had ruled for years. The conference room was sterile, with gray walls, a polished table, and rows of mismatched chairs that felt as uncomfortable as the tension in the air. Derek sat across from two Internal Affairs investigators, both of whom radiated a no-nonsense demeanor. Langston sat beside him, his presence steady, his briefcase filled with evidence that no one could ignore. The lead investigator, a woman with sharp eyes and a voice as steady as a metronome, leaned forward. Mr. Wilson, can you walk us through the events leading up to your arrest? Derek recounted everything in clear detail, how Wright had pulled him over, how Moore had searched his car, how the small bag of drugs had miraculously appeared. He kept his voice steady, though his jaw tightened when he described the insults, the threats, and Wright's smug arrogance. The investigator nodded, her pen scratching notes as he spoke. And the footage this was captured by hidden cameras in your vehicle? Yes, Derek said. I installed them after what happened to my brother. I didn't trust the system to protect me, so I decided to protect myself. Langston slid a folder across the table, containing screenshots and timestamps of the video. The footage is irrefutable, he said, his voice calm but firm. It clearly shows Wright and Moore planting evidence, and more importantly, it matches the pattern we've seen in other cases. The second investigator, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair, looked up from his notes. We've reviewed statements from other families, Mr. Wilson. Several describe similar behavior: false stops, planted evidence, intimidation. Your case has been a catalyst for others to come forward. Derek's chest tightened at the words. Those families deserve justice too, he said quietly. Not just me. The lead investigator studied him for a moment before closing her notebook. We appreciate your cooperation, Mr. Wilson. This investigation is far from over, but we're making progress. We've already suspended Wright and Moore pending the outcome, and given the evidence, it's likely the district attorney will bring charges. Langston gave a small, approving nod. That's what we wanted to hear. As they stood to leave, Derek's thoughts drifted to Marcus. For years, his brother's voice had been drowned out, lost in a system that had failed him. But now, the truth was finally being heard. Outside the office building, Derek and Langston stood near the curb as cars rushed past on the busy downtown street. Langston placed a firm hand on Derek's shoulder, his voice calm. This is a turning point, Derek. They're finally listening. Derek nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Wright and Moore still have to answer for what they've done. They will, Langston assured him. This is the beginning of the end for them. Derek exhaled slowly, feeling the weight on his shoulders shift. For the first time in years, it felt like progress, real progress. That night, Derek sat in his living room, the faint glow of his laptop illuminating his face as he scrolled through messages pouring in from strangers. The stories were endless people sharing their experiences of injustice, families who had been silenced, individuals thanking him for speaking up when they couldn't. One message stood out. You don't know me, but I know what you're fighting for. My brother was wronged too. Because of you, we believe in justice again. Thank you. Derek stared at the words for a long moment. A knot formed in his throat, and he set the laptop aside, leaning back against the couch. His phone buzzed, pulling him back to the moment. It was a text from Lisa. Breaking news tomorrow. Be ready. Wright and Moore are finally being charged. Derek's heart leapt into his throat. He read the words twice, hardly believing them. Tomorrow. It was happening. The next morning, Derek stood in his mother's living room, the old clock on the wall ticking faintly in the background. Margaret sat beside him on the couch, clutching his hand as they watched the news on television. A familiar anchor appeared on screen, the headline bold beneath her. Officers Wright and Moore charged, systemic misconduct uncovered. The anchor's voice carried the weight of the moment. In a press release early this morning, the district attorney announced that formal charges have been filed against officers James Wright and Ethan Moore. The charges include falsifying evidence, obstruction of justice, and abuse of power. An investigation into previous cases involving the two officers is now underway. Margaret squeezed Derek's hand, tears streaming down her face. "It's happening, Derek," she whispered. "You did it." Derek's throat felt tight, but he managed a small nod. "No, Mom, we did it. For Marcus." She pulled him into a hug, holding him tightly as the news continued to play in the background. For the first time, it felt like the walls Wright and Moore had built to protect themselves were finally collapsing. Later that day, Derek stood outside the courthouse, surrounded by reporters, protesters, and families who had come forward with their own stories. Reggie stood nearby, his deep voice booming as he addressed the crowd. "This is the beginning," Reggie called out, raising his hands. "We won't stop until justice is served, not just for Marcus Wilson, but for every family who has suffered under the weight of this system." The crowd erupted in cheers, their chants rising like thunder. "Justice for Marcus! Justice for all!" Derek looked out over the sea of faces, some familiar, some strangers, but all united for the same cause. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight lift just a little more. Wright and Moore would face the consequences of their actions. The truth had finally come to light, and the people were listening. The fight wasn't over, but Derek knew one thing for certain. Marcus's name would no longer be a whisper. It would be a symbol of hope, proof that justice, no matter how delayed, was still possible. The courthouse loomed large against the pale morning sky, its stone facade glowing faintly under the sun's first rays. A crowd had already gathered along the steps, their chants echoing through the crisp air. "Justice for Marcus! Justice for all!" Reporters lined the perimeter, microphones poised, cameras ready to capture every movement. Derek stood near the base of the steps, the weight of the moment heavy on his shoulders. The sound of people's voices filled him with resolve, but he could not ignore the knot tightening in his stomach. Today, Wright and Moore would face justice in court, and Derek would finally confront the men who had torn his family apart. Beside him, Langston adjusted his tie, his calm demeanor a grounding force. "Are you ready for this?" he asked, his sharp gaze fixed on Derek. Derek nodded slowly, his jaw tightening. "I've been ready for a long time." Langston clapped him on the shoulder. "Good. Remember, this trial isn't just about you. It's about every family they hurt. You're speaking for all of them today." Derek glanced at the crowd behind him, families holding photos of loved ones, signs demanding change. He spotted Reggie, standing tall near the front, leading chants with his booming voice. Lisa was there too, her notebook in hand, giving Derek a small nod when their eyes met. Jordan waved from the sidelines, his face filled with pride. Derek exhaled slowly and turned back toward the courthouse doors. "Let's finish this." The courtroom was silent. It was the kind of silence that felt heavy, like everyone in the room was holding their breath. The judge, an older woman with sharp features and a no-nonsense expression, sat high on the bench, her gavel resting in front of her. The prosecution team sat at one table, their stacks of evidence organized neatly. At the other table sat James Wright and Ethan Moore, both dressed in suits that could not hide their discomfort. Wright's face was hard, his jaw set like stone, but his eyes betrayed something else: fear. Moore sat beside him, pale and slouched, avoiding eye contact with anyone in the room. Derek sat behind the prosecution table, his hands folded tightly in his lap. He could feel Wright's gaze on him, but he refused to look back. This wasn't about intimidation anymore. The truth was out, and Derek had nothing to fear. "All rise," the bailiff announced. The room stood as the judge entered, her gavel striking the wood. "Court is now in session." The opening statements came quickly. The district attorney, a confident woman with a sharp voice, rose first. She faced the jury, her words deliberate and clear. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about abuse of power, about two officers who betrayed the trust placed in them and targeted innocent citizens for their own gain. We will show you undeniable evidence of their actions, from falsifying reports to planting evidence, and we will present the victims who had their lives destroyed because of it. This stops today." The defense attorney stood next, trying to maintain an air of control despite the uphill battle ahead. "This case is about perception," he began, his voice smooth but hollow. "In a world where the truth can be manipulated, we must be careful not to jump to conclusions. Officers Wright and Moore were doing their jobs under difficult circumstances. You will see that this entire case has been distorted." Derek's fists curled under the table as he listened. The lies sounded even worse in the sterile quiet of the courtroom. The first day of testimony was grueling. Lisa Collins took the stand early, recounting her investigation into Wright and Moore's misconduct. She spoke clearly and with precision, presenting stories from families who had come forward, each of them eerily similar false arrests, planted evidence, and ruined lives. The district attorney played clips of Derek's footage for the jury. The room was silent as Wright's voice rang out through the speakers. "You think you're untouchable? Out here, I decide what happens." The jury's faces were hard to read, but the tension was undeniable. The video left no room for excuses. Wright's anger, his intimidation, and his deliberate actions were on full display. Moore's nervous complicity was equally damning. When it was Derek's turn to testify, he rose from his seat with slow, deliberate movements. As he took the stand and settled into the chair, his heartbeat thrummed in his ears. He glanced briefly at Wright and Moore. Wright's face was hard and defiant, but Moore would not meet his eyes. The district attorney stepped forward, her voice firm but kind. "Mr. Wilson, can you tell us what happened on the day you were arrested?" Derek took a deep breath and began to speak. His voice was calm, steady, but filled with the weight of everything he had carried. He described the stop in detail, the flashing lights, the smug looks on Wright's face, the planted bag of drugs. His words hung in the air, punctuated by quiet gasps from the gallery. "Why did you have cameras in your car that day?" the district attorney asked. Derek's gaze turned toward the jury, his voice unwavering. "Because of my brother, Marcus Wilson. 2 years ago, Wright and Moore arrested him for a crime he didn't commit. They lied. They planted evidence, and no one believed us. I installed those cameras because I knew it would happen again, and I couldn't let them get away with it." The district attorney nodded. "And what did you do with the footage?" "I sent it to a friend immediately," Derek said. "I knew Wright and Moore would try to destroy it, so I made sure it was safe." "Why was it so important to you to capture this?" Derek's voice softened, but his resolve remained. "Because the truth matters. My brother spent 2 years in prison for nothing. 2 years of his life gone because no one listened. I couldn't let that happen to anyone else." The district attorney's tone turned sharp. "And to be clear, Mr. Wilson, the drugs Wright and Moore claimed to find in your car, were they yours?" "No," Derek said firmly. "They planted it, just like they did to Marcus." The defense attorney tried to rattle him on cross-examination, but Derek didn't budge. When asked if he held a vendetta against Wright and Moore, Derek's answer was clear. "I don't hold a vendetta. I want justice, not just for me, but for everyone they've hurt." When Derek stepped down from the stand, the weight in his chest felt lighter. For the first time in years, He felt like his voice had been heard. Over the next 2 days, more witnesses took the stand. Tommy Blake testified, his voice heavy with regret, describing the culture of silence that had protected Wright and Moore for years. Families shared their stories, stories of fear, of lost time, of ruined lives. Each testimony chipped away at the defense's case until there was nothing left to hide behind. On the final day, the district attorney's closing argument rang through the courtroom. These officers believed they were untouchable. They thought they could lie, cheat, and destroy lives without consequence. But today, you have the power to hold them accountable. Today, the truth wins. The jury deliberated for hours, but to Derek, it felt like days. He sat outside the courtroom, his mother beside him, holding his hand tightly. Langston paced nearby, his face unreadable. Finally, the doors opened, and the bailiff's voice echoed through the hall. The jury has reached a verdict. Derek stood slowly, his heart pounding, as they filed back into the room. The judge's voice was steady. On the charge of falsifying evidence, how does the jury find? Guilty? The word hit like a thunderclap. Derek's breath caught in his throat. On the charge of obstruction of justice? Guilty. On the charge of abuse of power? Guilty. Wright's face turned pale, his defiance slipping away as the final verdict was read. Moore slumped in his chair, his expression hollow. The judge's gavel struck the wood. This court finds both defendants guilty. Sentencing will proceed next week. Derek closed his eyes for a moment, letting the weight of the words settle over him. It was over. Marcus's name had been cleared. The truth had won. As Derek stepped into the sunlight outside the courthouse, the crowd erupted into cheers. People chanted Marcus's name, their voices rising like a wave of hope. Derek turned to his mother, who smiled through her tears. "You did it," she whispered. Derek shook his head, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. We did it. Justice had finally come. The air was crisp the morning Derek stood outside the prison gates, the sky above clear and endless. He rubbed his hands together against the chill, his breath visible as he exhaled slowly. Today was the day his brother Marcus would finally walk free. Derek could hardly believe it, though the heaviness in his chest, the weight of everything they had endured, was beginning to lift. Beside him, their mother, Margaret, clutched a small paper cup of coffee, her hands trembling slightly. She kept glancing at the gates as if willing them to open sooner. "How long has it been?" she asked softly, though her eyes remained fixed ahead. "Not much longer, Mom," Derek replied, his voice steady. "They said 10 o'clock. Margaret nodded, though her smile was faint and uncertain. "It just feels like we've been waiting forever." Derek swallowed hard. "We have." The last 2 weeks had been a blur. After Wright and Moore were found guilty, their sentencing hearing had brought some closure. Wright had been sentenced to 15 years in prison, Moore to 8. The judge's words had echoed through the courtroom that day. "You abused the power entrusted to you, and now you will face the consequences." For Derek, the sentencing had been a victory, but it hadn't been the end. Marcus was still behind bars, paying for a crime he didn't commit. The process of overturning his conviction had moved faster than expected, a result of the overwhelming evidence and the public pressure that had refused to die down. And now, after 2 long years, Marcus was coming home. The faint sound of grinding metal broke Derek's thoughts. The prison gates began to creak open, and Derek straightened, his pulse quickening. Margaret stepped forward instinctively, her face crumpling with emotion as a figure appeared in the doorway. It was Marcus. He walked slowly at first, his posture strong but cautious, as if testing the reality of his own freedom. He wore dark jeans and a clean button-up shirt, clothes Derek had brought for him the day before. His face, older now and etched with lines of wear, softened when he saw them waiting for him. The weight of prison had aged him, but his eyes still held a familiar spark. "Marcus!" Margaret cried, rushing toward him. She wrapped her arms tightly around her son, her sobs breaking through the silence. Derek stayed back for a moment, watching the two of them as the world seemed to pause. Marcus closed his eyes, holding their mother with care. "I'm here, Mama," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm here." Finally, he looked up, his gaze locking onto Derek's. For a moment, they just stood there, brothers separated by time and pain, but brought together by something stronger. Derek stepped forward, his chest tight. "Hey, man." Marcus managed a small, uneven smile. "You did it, little brother." Derek shook his head. "No, we did it." Marcus pulled him into a hug, his grip firm and unshaking. "Thank you," Marcus said quietly, "for not giving up." Derek felt his throat tighten, but he swallowed the emotion down. "I promised you I'd fix this." "You did more than that," Marcus replied, his voice steady. "You gave me my life back." The drive home was quiet, but comfortable, the kind of silence that spoke volumes. Marcus sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window at the world he hadn't seen in years. Derek stole glances at him every now and then, his heart swelling with a mix of relief and sadness. 2 years of Marcus's life had been stolen moments he would never get back, but now, at least, he had the chance to start over. As they pulled into the driveway of their childhood home, Marcus exhaled slowly, taking it all in. "It hasn't changed," he murmured. "Mom kept it the same," Derek replied. "She wanted you to come home to something familiar." Margaret was already waiting at the door, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She smiled through her tears as Marcus stepped out of the car and looked up at the house. "Welcome home, baby," she said softly. Marcus smiled faintly, following her inside. Derek trailed behind, pausing to glance up at the sky, which had turned a soft shade of gold. For the first time in what felt like forever, the air didn't feel heavy. Inside, the house smelled like home. The familiar scent of Margaret's cooking roast chicken and cornbread filled the air, wrapping around them like a warm blanket. Marcus sat down at the dining table, running a hand over the wood surface as if grounding himself. "It's good to be home," he said finally, his voice quiet but certain. Margaret placed a steaming plate in front of him, her smile trembling. "You're too thin. Eat." Marcus chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You haven't changed one bit, Mama." Derek sat across from him, watching as Marcus took his first bite of home-cooked food in 2 years. For a moment, everything felt normal, like no time had passed at all. Later that evening, Derek and Marcus sat out on the front porch. The neighborhood was quiet, the stars flickering faintly above. Marcus leaned back in the old rocking chair, his eyes turned toward the sky. "What now?" Marcus asked, breaking the silence. Derek leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "What do you mean?" Marcus shrugged. "You fought so hard for this for me, but I know this fight isn't over. Wright and Moore might be gone, but there's still a system that let them do what they did. What happens now?" Derek exhaled slowly, his gaze distant. "I don't know. I guess we keep pushing. There are still families out there who deserve justice. People who need to be heard." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "You're not done yet." "No," Derek said quietly. "Not yet." Marcus studied him for a moment before speaking. "You know, when I was inside, I used to think about you. About what you'd say if you saw me like that. I thought you'd hate me." Derek turned to look at him sharply. "I never hated you, Marcus. Not for 1 second." "I know that now," Marcus said with a small smile. "But back then, I couldn't see it. I thought they'd won, that the world had forgotten me." He paused, his voice softening. "But you didn't." Derek swallowed hard, his voice steady. "You were never alone, Marcus. Not then, not now." Marcus nodded, leaning back in his chair. "I'll help you, you know, with whatever comes next." Derek smiled faintly. You just got out. You don't need to worry about that yet. I want to, Marcus replied firmly. You stood up for me when I couldn't. Now it's my turn. The two brothers sat in silence after that, the weight of the past giving way to something lighter hope. The porch creaked softly under the rocking chair as the cool night air brushed against their faces. Derek looked up at the stars, his chest swelling with something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. The fight had been long and hard, but they had made it through. Wright and Moore were gone, their power stripped away. Marcus was free, his name cleared, and the world was finally listening. For the first time, the future felt like something they could build together, something they could believe in. We'll figure it out, Derek said softly. Marcus smiled, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Yeah, we will. The night stretched out before them, quiet and full of promise. For Derek, it wasn't just an ending, it was a beginning. A chance to build something better. A new beginning for both of them. Thank you for watching this powerful story of resilience, justice, and hope. If this story resonated with you, remember that the fight for truth and accountability begins with people willing to stand up and speak out, just like Derek did for his brother Marcus. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more compelling narratives that inspire change, courage, and hope, please subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Your support helps us continue to share stories that matter. Together we can amplify voices, inspire action, and make a difference. Like, share, and subscribe. And let us know in the comments what stories of resilience you'd like to hear next. Thank you, and we'll see you in the next story.